And our first speaker is Professor Dirk Tänzler. Professor Tänzler holds a PhD from the University of Frankfurt am Main and a habilitation from the University of Konstanz, and now is a professor at our university in Bonn. He's a very active researcher, and his interests are also very diverse. I might mention a book that might be interesting both for lawyers and social scientists, a book on incest verbot. And his forthcoming book will be on making global civil society, which I also find very interesting. But today, Professor Tänzler offers to talk to us about reading Hobbes with Durkheim. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Bucholc, and thank you very much for invitation. Okay, I'm not an expert neither on Durkheim, neither on Hobbes, but I'm only sociologist. But I will speak about a conversation between these thinkers. So, in my talk, I will feign a reading of Thomas Hobbes by Émile Durkheim. The encounter between the founding fathers of modern political theory and sociology will take place under the canopy of a third party, the law. To close the gap between means and ends in Hobbes' theory of the social contract, I will use Durkheim's famous phrase of the non-contractual element in the contract in his early work, De l'attribution du travail social. So you can find some translations of these phrases. I will only show, I will don't speak about this. You all know his core argument. Division of labor is not so much a function of needs, but a symbol of solidarity. If this is true, we have to ask for society as a symbolic order, as Durkheim exercises in his late work, the forme élémentaire de la vie religieuse. The conclusion of his reconstruction here is articulated in the equation of God and society. There is no hint in the text, but can we interpret this as an allusion to Hobbes' idea of the Leviathan as an artificial god? In a Durkheimian perspective, social facts are things and symbols. Hence, society is a real assembly of individuals bound together by a shared idea of utopian society. In order to function, society has to be constituted as a symbolic order. Surprisingly, the intermediating term is emotion. Social institutions are constituted by an idée directive, but are based on feeling, wants, and expectations. Nevertheless, socially relevant are not emotions or instinct as such, but their interpretation. What Freud calls instinctual representatives, in German Triebrepräsentanz, or Pareto residues. Needs and ideas are linked by ritual behavior and transformed in human drives or residues as symbolic constellations. In a ritual, ego transcends him or herself and recognizes order. For Durkheim, therefore, the ritual is society in statu nascendi. As a functional system, society, in the Latin version societas, is seen as an objective mechanism or machine of procedures, in German Verfahren. As community, in Latin universitas, the same thing is a symbolic entity. The difference between societas and universitas refers to two forms of representation: the rational representation of proxy and the irrational identity representation that are, as I will show, at the core of Hobbes' political theory. To understand how representation and social contract are linked, we have to consult the history of law. According to the Roman legal tradition, the societas is a contract-based partnership, whereas the universitas is the idea of a corporation that is a long-term religious and social community analogous to the family. The archetype of the societas and the modern European state is the Catholic Church. As a true hierarchical sovereign association, it is a corpus fictum that must obey the Pope, who is a manifestation of representation of the rule of Christ. In the form of the Universitas, the paternalistic custodial representation by proxy by the head of the association as a good shepherd is confronted with the representation of identity of a representative body whose head is not the Pope, rather Christ himself. The second type of representation is based on a transcendent principle of identity, the identity of the representative and the represented, endowed by the Spirit who has come by way of the believers and is present in them, and not just in the priest. The priest indeed remains the organ of the body of the church, but only an embodiment, in Latin persona representativa, of the animate, nevertheless invisible reality of the congregation, collectio representativa. The representation of identity puts the ulterior irrational hierocratic legitimization by God in the place of the secular formula rational hierarchical legitimization, and hence fundamentally undermines the rule of the Catholic Church under the leadership of the Pope. Hobbes sequently is regarded as the founder of the contract theory and generally not as a relevant author with regard to the problem of representation. However, the notion of contract and notion is, as Johannes Weiss showed, belong together in his political theory. However, it was Ferdinand Tönnies who pointed out the key role of the concept of representation in Hobbes' political theory, by which the science of politics is replaced by the primacy of law and morality, and thus from any metaphysics of the will. While the notion of politics from Plato and Aristotle to the Church Fathers were focused on the quest for the good ruler and the common good, the modern understanding separates the political realm from the moral realm. Hobbes carries out the radical reinterpretation of political action praxis to an artificial construction of the political sphere, poiesis. According to Max Weber, who further subscribes to this instrumental understanding, domination or governance, identical to order, advances to become a value in itself, an autonomous sphere that is no longer scientifically dealt with within the framework of the practical, rather theoretical reason. At the heart of his new science of politics are the doctrine of serenity and the theory of representation. Hobbes' choice for sovereignty in the understanding of absolutism is a decision, firstly, against the idea of the Universitas, together with the representation of identity based on irrational belief, and secondly, for the idea of a rational construction of the Societas as a contract-based community with representation by proxy. At the moment of its differentiation into an autonomous sphere of action, Hobbes recognizes representation as the core of the political realm. Hobbes attempts to make the fact of the state plausible by means of the fiction of a social contract. This step was necessary because the liberal fundaments of Leviathan, based on the laws of nature, thus the idea of free men by birth, made the antique notion of a justification for authority derived from the nature of man in the Zoon Politikon obsolete. The fiction of a social contract should allow for a rational explanation for submission to the state derived from the principle of self-preservation. Man who is free by nature forgoes his unrestricted freedom because he attains a higher good for doing so, life itself, and the condition of securing his existence in the long-term peace. However, peace can be brought about neither by the rational decision nor by self-preservation. because self-preservation leads to the bellum omnis contra omnes, and under these conditions alone, the oppression and, if need be, killing of the opponent is rational. It is then also the irrational fear of death by the other which leads to the rational conclusion that everyone forgoes unrestricted freedom and the right to self-defense and transfers both to representative by proxy. On the one hand, the social contract is a contract between natural, that means uncommitted individuals, to reach a certain objective, not an alliance to foster cooperation with one's own identity and a collective goal, which goes beyond self-preservation. The fulfillment of the contract is also bound to representation, though. Hobbes gives the social contract based on Roman law the form of an agreement to the benefit of a third party who is not bound by his contract, him or herself. Furthermore, the social contract is designed as a contract on domination, in German Herrschaftsvertrag, not as a contract of privilege, in German Begünstigungsvertrag, according to the model of the mutual fiefdom durationship, in Deutsch Lehnsverhältnis, which could be terminated by both partners in case of violation, and thus again evokes the danger of a civil war in Hobbes' view. The social contract as domination contract cannot be terminated by the subjects under the assumption of breach of contract, because the sovereign was and is not the partner in the contract. As he did not have to and did not promise anything, the sovereign is entirely free and unconstrained. The contract does not constitute an agreement of volition and not a mandate-based relationship within a body with equal representation, rather a custodian-based relationship in accordance with Roman law, which only spans, however, to the public matters of the subject and not to the private interest of the citizen. This unresolved tension between liberalism and authoritarianism in Hobbes' work becomes very clear when he attests citizens, on the one hand, religious freedom and the right to desertion, and on the other hand, requires from them lip services to the state religion and submission to the laws of the sovereign. Hence, representation in proxy in terms of acting on behalf of means for Hobbes the delegation of power, and parallel to the Roman relationship of custodianship, not the representation of interests. In contrast to the citizen or bourgeois, the subject later on in history substituted by the citoyen has no interests and rights, rather only obligations. According to the antique model, representation by proxy in Hobbes also means to bring to present. In the corporal representation of the sovereign, the people take on their real shape. The people as people only exist in and through representation, and are only distinguished from the sovereign in the fictive moment of the formal completion of the contract. In terms of content, the contract has a consequence that the people submit themselves to the sovereign and thus disintegrate with the sovereign. It's double meaning that only the sovereign embodies the unified people, while the citizens reconvert themselves into a crowd of single individuals. Not by coincidence, Hobbes described this oddly changing transition between the state of nature and state of society in theatrical concepts. First, he introduced the concept of representation in terms of presentation or performance in the highly significant 16th chapter. The representative is a performer, a role player. Like at the theater, an actor presents the roles created by an author, the poet. The term authorization functions here as a terminus comparationis on the basis of which representation with and without representative power such as mandate and custodianship can be distinguished. The intricate line of argument targets the problem of the personification of a crowd or multitude and the derivation of a consensus from individual contractual obligations of the individual wills. Okay, here is now the famous passage from Hobbes. A multitude of men are made one person when they are by one man or one person represented. So that is, it be done with the consent of everyone of that multitude in particular. For it is the unity of the representer, not the unity of the represented, that marks the person one. And it is the representer that bears the person and but one person. And unity cannot otherwise be understood in multitude. The language of the text passage, just like the matter it describes, is marked by ambiguity. Even more, Hobbes makes use of the equivocations here which lie in the concept of representation, so that this text passage is characterized not so much by an argument as by suggestion. Underhandedly, the meaning of the expression proxy and representation is transformed here. Hobbes' theory of representation essentially contains elements which are not automatically compatible with his identification of the social contract with the domination contract, and with his theory of absolute sovereignty. The tension revealed in Hobbes' writings culminate in the construct of voluntary submission. This paradox pertains to the double character of the raison d'etre. On the one hand, it is founded on the principle of self-preservation of individuals. On the other hand, it aspires for the self-preservation of a symbolic order. However, both topics cannot be reduced to a single denominator and thus remain enigmatic, even in Leviathan. The artificial God, Leviathan, is as unfathomable as God in heaven. The legitimacy is not a rational one, rather a mystery, the embodiment. The visual depiction of the corpus politicum on the title page is thus not a mere illustration to accompany the text of Leviathan. As shown in the following analysis, it does not serve to understand the representation, rather to performatively generate it. Okay, yes, we have this nice picture here. Yes, you know. Like the Greeks, Hobbes mistrusts seduction by word and writing, but replaces musical art, which the Greeks regarded as a means of political education, with visual arts. The power of the better argument can neither bring about nor secure the transition to the state condition. This requires the power of a rationally constructed technical medium which impresses the soul by means of the senses and turns the multitude into citizens. The representation of representation in the frontispiece of Leviathan demonstrates and camouflages a moment of seduction immanent to representation, so that the contract of domination appears like a natural element in a cosmological order. In the Millard gallery of representation, the difference between sovereign actor in German Subjekt and Subjekt in German Objekt is irrealized. Like in a ritual, they appear as vehicles of a superiority or surreality. The doer of this imagined seduction is the victim himself. Like in the psychodynamic primal scene in Freud, the primal social scene and its origin, the bellum omnium contra omnis, that Hobbes speaks of in Leviathan, need not be naturalistically interpreted as real historic events, rather in functional and symbolic terms as a phantasmagorical founding myth evoked by ritual action. I will say something to this picture. According to the historian of arts Horst Bredekamp, the frontispiece of Hobbes' Leviathan functions like an effigy. bridges over the interregnum between the death of the king and the crowning of his successor, which facilitates the civil war. In both cases, the individual death of the ruler poses the danger of the social death of order, the intrusion of the state of nature into the social state, and the bellum omnium contra omnes. The individually and socially looming destruction by death must be ritually averted in the effigy, which eternalizes the royal dignity. The same applies to the image of the body politic in Hobbes' Leviathan. Quotation marks, the empty space between the words of the contract and the overall body of the state is filled by the visible power of the image, Durkheim said. To turn contracts and laws into controlled actions, words must be transformed into bodies. And it is the image of Leviathan that effectuates this intermediary step. End of quotation. Durkheim interprets the scene of the man forming the corpus and looking up to the sovereign as a caput as a pseudo-sacral act of creating the mortal god by the convocation. Again, Durkheim, the frontispiece closed the gap between the representative and represented in order to heal the symbolic Achilles heel of the Leviathan, not to be physically perceptible as an entire body. End of quotation. Subsequently, one might postulate that Hobbes offers an optical construction of the representation of identity in the frontispiece, which he attempts to unravel geometrically according to the Leitwissenschaft of his time, geometry. In the end, he only hangs a new veil of faith in rationality on it. For at least in one point, the conclusion of the contract remains irrational, namely when rationality turns into blind obedience and people become subjects, German Untertan. The gap in the logical derivation of the representation overbridged by the image left its mark in the picture. The optical construction of the representation has a blind spot. The frontispiece of the Leviathan, Essel Matala de Mazza argues, makes representation as a presentation of a visual being and as a representation by proxy of an invisible being, visual. All, the king, the people, Hobbes, and God, as a universal observer, are in the picture. But, quotation marks, there are no longer any represented individuals existing for themselves. The life that Leviathan protects is purchased in a symbolic exchange of one's own face for the mask of the political person. What the despot's claim to power keeps away from the bodies, the symbolic exchange executed with symbols, death, now sealed in the obliteration of the individual as actor. End of citation. The disavowal of the self is decoded here as a more or less ideologically motivated error. The disavowal of self or personal identity is, however, the core of all civilizing rationality and a structural moment inherent to agency. Genetically, its first manifestation, as Sigmund Freud shows, using the examples of ego splitting in view of the threat of castration and fetishism, and as Durkheim and Adorno demonstrate with the adventures of Odysseus, whose name can mean both hero as well nobody. Udris in Greek. Self or identity is born out of defense and no substantial entity in itself. The interpretation of the obeisance, Huldigung, as extinction, suggested by Durkheim and de Mazza, only addresses the social contract from the perspective of the societas, the applicable order and representation by proxy. This technical representation that is in the focus of Hobbes' political thinking and which is allegorized in the frontispiece does not yet sufficiently explain the process. Indeed, traces of the irrational identity representation and the holistic idea of the universitas can be found in the frontispiece. What is modern about Hobbes' construction is that he ties the domination contracts, thus the paternalistic societas, to the social contract and the representation of identity. By tying together both contracts, he lets the holy universitas be absorbed by the profane societas, and identity vanishes into the representation by proxy. The societas thereby obscures its natural and divine origin and becomes an artificial contract, created by free men for their own protection. The paradox of the social contract, the puzzle of the mystery of self-transformation of a wild horde into an ordered society, was described by Émile Durkheim as a central sociological problem and defined as a search for the non-contractual in the contract. Durkheim's solution is to analyze the transition structurally and genetically as a ritual. Therefore, we must interpret the genesis of society not only in legal terms as a contract, rather on sociological foundations as a passage ritual according to Arnold van Gennep. A ritual produces a religious community which assures its long-term existence by creating a self-image and representation, a representative, to whom it transfers the ritual function as well as its embodiment and interpretation. However, this interpretation, also suggested by Vögelin, leads to a problem. It irrealizes the social contract, which no longer is merely absorbed in the rational construction of the societas, but also takes on properties of the mystic identity representation of the universities. The rational construction of the Leviathan conceals a puzzle that cannot be rationally solved. The frontispiece of the Leviathan is in the eyes of Bredekamp and Marta not just an adequate symbolization of the theory of representation, rather the meaningful unity of words and images. These interpretations primarily refer to the form and substance of the image and examine the interplay with the text. However, from the perspective of perception aesthetics, the image is taken as a protocol of social action and performative construction of reality. This view opens up avenues for an interpretation of the representation of representation in the depiction of the Leviathan in sociological terms of media and ritual. From this perspective, the real human beholder in the front of the image moves into the position of the idol beholder who is generally identified with God. The classical interpretation. The large transcendence that eludes any experience, as Schutz and Luckmann say, is then substituted by the medium transcendence between two actors, which can be bridged by way of face-to-face interaction and profane reciprocal understanding. In the act of image perception, the beholder is removed from everyday reality and pulled into the reality of images. But in the act of image understanding, he is again referred by this image reality to the behavioral reality of the actor, because understanding is only possible with recourse to a social knowledge base. The intention of the image is ultimately not fulfilled in the tranquility of the uninterested pleasure taken in admiring the items in the image. The protopopeia of the political sphere or the form of the image structure, which can be read as an allegory of representation, rather only, to use Hegel's term, in the reflection on the experience of the conscious inaugurated by seeing. From the iconographic perspective, the columns of the solid basement are composed like a stage for the primal scene of politics, in which the multitude is united in and with the sovereign, whose sword and bishop's crosier form the frame of the image protruding roof. This theatrical and ritual structure of the image inaugurates a second approach of reception aesthetics. The eyes of the beholder are directed to the face of the sovereign. This eye contact at the same level creates proximity, an impression underscored by the open arms of the sovereign. Both a protective gesture in relation to the multitude on the narrative level of the visual content, as well as an inviting gesture to the beholder on the experiential level of aesthetical reception. In the next step, both perspectives are fused. The beholder is requested to proceed under the protective arms of the sovereign, who is armed with the insignias of the spiritual power and the secular power, and line up in the crowd of people forming the body of the sovereign. The exchange of glances at eye level between beholder and Leviathan, which signals mutual recognition and opens face-to-face interaction, appears to be repeated mycologically and en detail in the central content of the image, as if the figure based on the caput corpus scheme embodies the representative relationship, which the beholder conceptualized in his head as an internal image. On the stretched out arms of the figure, one sees people rushing towards the crowd, forming the upper body of the figure. All people forming the body of the figure are looking at his head, some of them even in a kneeling pose. Yet the glance of the individuals in the crowd is not reciprocated by the sovereign. The invitation to come closer turns into a marker of distance and into an act of obeisance between unequals. Seduced by the aesthetics of the Good Shepherd's representation, the observer puts himself in the place of the crowd, which is unified under the canopy formed by the sovereign arms and looking up to his head. Impalpably, an asymmetric and ultimately hierarchical power relation has been established, which incorporates the beholder, but remains unseizable because it surmounts what is presented in the picture. The difference and distance of the sovereign to the peasantry is represented by the metaphorical symbol, one for the other, of the sea monster rising from the waters, the Leviathan. At the same time, though, the festive clothing of those participating in the obeisance ritual on a Sunday underscore the fact that the artificial body politics appears as a whole in distance to deserted everyday life world, which becomes visible below the figure. Together, caput and corpus, now as a manifestation of a metonymic relationship, pars pro toto, form the island kingdom of the Commonwealth. A Commonwealth is more than and different from a gathering of people. It is inspired by Christ's kingdom of heaven based on the idea of the Universitas. In a Calvinistic understanding, the sea monster Leviathan is, according to Carl Schmitt, a spitting image of the horrible and unpredictable Deus absconditus. But this impression, he argues, does not coincide with the face of the sovereign on the frontispiece, which looks anything but fierce and scary, rather like a benevolent father, and yes, friendly and merciful, like Jesus Christ, close and similar to the people. An object suggesting proximity and thus predestined for the representation of identity. The relationship between the sovereign and the people is thus indeed ambivalent. There's another version of this picture. In fact, the individuals who as a multitude form the body of the Leviathan do not only gaze spellboundedly at the sovereign, but represent themselves and also communicate among each other. In other versions, they turn together with the sovereign towards the beholders. However, the representation optic shown in the original form disappears. Both forms of representation do not stand abruptly or even incompatibly next or across from one another, rather in a mutual relationship. The opposition between humiliation and elevation is ritually resolved in a new mystical quality. The absolute power of the sovereign coerces us into simulation and obscuration. However, it is not the asymmetric exchange of glances between the people and the sovereign, illustrated in the picture, which according to the corpus caput scheme creates the representation relationship, and to which a seemingly neutral observer sheets his distanced glances. The representation as a social relationship is realized by the incorporation of all potential beholders thanks to the technical installation of an optical medium. The framing of the image curses the beholder to initiate an imaginary exchange of glances with the sovereign and thus to constitute the meaning of the image. The observer not only sees himself forced to comprehend the apparently manifested meaning in the image, rather to generate the latent meaning of the image in the act of seeing, which consists in socially positioning him towards the sovereign as a sovereign and undergoing a change of face, Deutsch Gesinnungswandel, as a conditio sine qua non of representation. As shown by the analysis, the form and content of the image are conceived to the end that the relationship between the image and non-image reality are central parts of the significance and meaning of the image, which surmounts for its one part what is depicted in the image. All of this disrupts the textual meaning of the Leviathan. Due to the described interplay between the iconography and perception aesthetics analysis, the representation by proxy, the present obeisance, is transcended in the eye contact between the beholder and sovereign at equal level to the representation of identity. Behind the rational construction of the societas, incorporated by the Leviathan, the mystic universitas shines through, making the sovereign the representative of God, and thus ultimately an artificial image of the true Lord created by humans. Representation is not delusion or manipulation, rather the construction of a symbolic reality. This artificial order world exists in the image as a communicative medium. Bin gleich soweit. Looking at the image, the beholder moves from his reality in front of the image into the reality of the image and places himself in this swelling and floating state of the communitas. Communitas is Victor Turner's term for the identity representation in the liminal phase of the ritual, a synonym for the experience of the universitas. The communitas, the universitas, is the mysterious root and reason for the rational construction of order and the non-contractual element of the contract that remains omitted in Hobbes' text. Hobbes' text only deals with the concept of the societas. Consequently, the universitas is not represented in the image, but indeed is created in the viewing of the image. In analogy to the transforming action of a ritual, which put us in a different stage of being, the exchanges of glances in the image, as if broken by a kaleidoscope or telescope, led us into the imaginary sphere of representation. The receptive immersion into the image is the formation of the identity representation that creates the universitas or action or experience of communitas. Ladies and gentlemen, we are coming to the end of our wearisome journey through the abyss of sociological and political theory. I will not end without giving you a proof of a practical application of our intractable insights to contemporary phenomena and a better understanding of seemingly profane matters. Elections are institutionalized and formalized procedures of modern political life with real effects. They express the will of the sovereign and bring people to power. Beyond the fact that they are crucial means of the democratic political process, elections are an end in itself. In time of postal vote, or as the Americans say more adequately, absentee ballot, the fundamental idea of elections is not anymore perceptible. I remember my parents wearing their best clothes at the polling day as if they want to go to church. They were going to participate at an extraordinary event. The election is a central ritual of the cult of democracy, comparable with the sacrament at the Christian church. if there is no central contagion experience in an assembly of believers participating in the worship of the religious community, Durkheim claims, faith loses all convincibility and diminishes. What happens in the ritual of the election? It irrealizes all social differences and contrafactually equalizes all. All individuals feel as citizen or citoyen, equipped with the same power, one vote. In between the imaginative reality that is constituted by the ritual of the election, the subject of domination becomes regularly and time limited, but space and time lose relevance in the liminal phase of the ritual, member of the communitas of free and equal citizen, and sovereign of the political process. In contrast to a partaker in a dominion-free discourse, the voter has real power when throwing the ballot paper in the urn, that is, when performing a symbolic act. He has this power as an individual, but as a member of the communitas. As members of the communitas, citizens announce their will and exercise power to nominate a representative to whom, in a second ritual, the inauguration power is delegated. The ritual of the election generates the imaginative social contract and the symbolic reality of sovereignty in an act of identity representation. The following ritual of inauguration executes the real contract of domination, that is, proxy representation, the delegation of power, and the submission under the will of the representative who is legitimized to act in the name of the citizens and to claim for their obedience. Now we understand why there is resistance against the proposition to install voting machines in banks, supermarkets, and shopping malls to boost the voter turnout. To celebrate the core ritual of democracy in such fake temples would have consequences contrary to the well-meant intention. The meaning and therefore the functioning of the ritual of the election would be destroyed. The disenchantment with politics in the long run would be fostered. Thank you.